Greetings, everyone. My name is Emily Louie, and on behalf of Campbell Company, I would like to welcome you to Environment and COVID-19, sharing challenges, successes, and advice. We want to thank you all for joining us today and hope we can provide some relief during this difficult time. Before we begin today's presentation, I'd like to quickly go through some logistics for those of you who may be new to our webinars. First, please close any programs other than GoToWebinar that are running on your computer. Next, we recommend calling in with a telephone instead of using your computer speakers. And if you experience any visual issues, please send a chat to Campbell Company or contact GoToWebinar at the number on your screen. Today's webinar is being recorded and will last 60 minutes. Within the next 24 hours, you will receive an email from GoToWebinar that includes information on how to access the recording. We do welcome questions for the webinar, so please use the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel that should be on the right side of your computer screen. We will also hold time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. Now I'd like to turn it over to our presenters today, Communications Senior Consultant Pat Chesnut, Fundraising Consultant Lauren Collette, and Executive Search Senior Consultant Colleen Rodgers.
Thank you, Emily. So thanks a lot for joining us, everyone. We're really excited just to have this opportunity to step back and share with all of you what we've been seeing and hearing from other organizations. I think we've learned a lot, both as we've watched our environmental clients, but as we prepared for this webinar. And I think there's a lot for us to discuss and figure out together. Just by way of introduction, my name is Pat Chestnut. I'm a senior communications consultant at Campbell Company. So that really means I work first and foremost on donor messaging, though also a little bit more broadly at times too. I've been with Campbell about 9.5 years, during which time I've been fortunate enough to work with a wide variety of environmental organizations, from local land trusts to state-level policy organizations to some of the real national leaders in the space. It's really just something I care a lot about. It's a personal passion and commitment of mine, but also something that's really been exciting during this time of growth in the sector. And today I'm calling in and talking to you from Chicago. So hello.
Great, and my name is Lauren Collette, and I am a fundraising consultant here at Campbell Company. I've been with the firm close to 4 years now, and I am located in our Seattle office. My background really focuses on all kinds of individual fundraising, so board management, special events and galas, annual mid-major giving, as well as online fundraising. And I did that work out in Washington, D.C. in the arts and culture sector. But I've been really fortunate, much like Pat, the environmental conservation landscape is really a personal passion point of mine. So since joining the firm, I've been very fortunate to work with a lot of local and national leading organizations, focusing on environmental, land trusts, conservations, and so forth, on really just a variety of their fundraising needs. So I'm really pleased to be here with you today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Colleen Rodgers. I am a senior consultant in the executive search practice at Campbell Company, and I've been with the firm for just over 11 years now. In my role with executive search, I recruit senior leaders for nonprofit organizations. Similar to Pat and Lauren, the environmental sector and conservation have always been important to me personally. My background is actually in historic preservation, so much more aligned to conservation of the built environment, but also have always had a love for all things environmental as well. Along with the director of our executive search practice, I've really had the pleasure of helping to build out our work with environmental organizations, and have had the opportunity to work with a lot of them over the years, including the National Park Foundation, Environmental Defense Fund, Trust for Public Land, World Wildlife, and American Prairie Reserve. And it's always interesting to me to see the different ways that organizations address these issues and the full spectrum of that work. Similar to Pat, I work out of Campbell Company Chicago office, but I'm calling in today from my home in Northwest Indiana.
Great. So I'm just going to quickly walk us through our agenda at a high level. So we're going to share some of the lessons that Campbell Company has learned in other challenging times throughout our firm's history. we're going to, much as Pat said in the introduction, really just share what we're hearing from clients, what we're learning, and just who we've been talking to across the sector. We're also going to be sharing some suggested strategies for how to navigate some things in the coming months. And then, as Emily mentioned at the introduction, please feel free to submit your questions, anything you want to share with us that we can learn from in the chat box, so that in the second half, we can dedicate some time to your questions and your learnings and findings too. So to kick us off, we're going to talk learnings from other challenging times. So we don't have a crystal ball to tell us how we're going to look and what this is all going to look like on the other side of this. But we're fortunate enough to be able to glean some learnings from other challenging times that can at least help us navigate what we're dealing with today. When speaking about challenging times, our firm's really specifically talking about the dot-com crash in the mid-90s, September 11th, and then more recently, the Great Recession starting in 2007. So a question that our firm is commonly asked during times of crisis is, oh my gosh, will donors stop giving? And the answer we can share is no. Donors don't stop giving, but their behaviors may shift. And so what we mean by that is that they may narrow the number of organizations they give to, and generally focus on supporting their top few charitable causes. So as a result of that finding, we have found that organizations that stay in close touch with their donors, and especially those mid-level major donors, tend to fare much better than those who don't. You're going to hear this from us a lot today, but in the coming weeks and months, authentic, frequent, mission-driven communications and just touch points is really going to help ensure that you remain at the top of your donors' minds and that they also stay connected to your work during this time. So Pat, Colleen, and I, when we were prepping for this webinar, also wanted to look at how environmental organizations and giving were impacted by the Great Recession. So we, of course, looked to Giving USA for that data. And what we found was that there was about a 5 to 6% decline in environmental giving from 2007 to 2008 and 2008 to 2009. However, giving to the environmental sector quickly bounced back. Just to give you an idea, in a little over a decade, environmental giving has doubled. In 2007, it was about $6.9 billion, and in 2019, about 12.7. So this sector has seen immense growth in the past decade, and that means many of your donors have been with you for years and are supporting your mission. So even though there are a lot of needs right now in our communities and in the world, your donors are going to want to give and stay with you as an environmental organization as long as they're kept close. So something that I've been sharing with my clients is just, what are you doing today to address donor retention? If you're not in close touch with, your supporters, there are other organizations that may fill that void. So, my thought around this is, as you look to your to-do list, which I know is really busy and probably growing every day, I really encourage you just to prioritize fundraising activities that focus on donor retention and communications. And our firm has seen that you will fare better on the other side of this crisis. So the third bullet really speaks to, I don't think this is completely surprising, but it is worth mentioning, that donors will take longer to make decisions about significant gifts, especially those backed by accumulated wealth in the market. This makes perfect sense to me. Donors are going to need more time if they see, market volatility or just in general times of uncertainty. But something that I can share here is that I would still look at donors and your supporters on a case-by-case basis. Just last week, I'm working with a local campaign here in Seattle. It's a green space, and they had a family foundation make a decision at the end of March to support them with a really significant donation that they had been working on cultivating for years. And so something to speak to here, and we'll talk more about this later on, is that give your donors time and space if they need it, but that doesn't mean you need to stop fundraising altogether. So fourth, and I really love to share this positive finding, I actually think this is great, and I hope this brings some of you comfort out there if you're in the middle or starting or just wrapping up a campaign, is that during the Great Recession, our firm, 95%, we saw that campaigns that we were working on in 2008 to 2010 met or exceeded their goals. So in certain instances, organizations decided to extend their timelines or benchmarks in order to meet their goals. And again, I think we are all on this journey where we're not really sure how our future timelines are going to unfold. And so that makes sense that if you have to adjust in a pivot, go for it. Campaigns are long and you find that you have to adjust and pivot several times throughout a campaign. But the fact is that it's not a direct correlation with a crisis and not completing your campaign. And for the relatively small percentage of campaigns that didn't make their goal, it was not a direct correlation to the recession. They were already experiencing some either internal or external challenges that were really the primary reason for them not completing their campaign. Colleen, I'm going to hand it over to you to speak to this last bullet point.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. I think especially in the Great Recession, if we're looking back, which is still a recent enough memory that a lot of people still remember, and the lessons learned, frankly, and what came out of that situation. At that time, we really saw a lot of talent coming into the market. Unfortunately, people were being laid off and let go from the organizations they were with for a number of reasons. We also saw a lot of people who were really taking a look at transitioning into the nonprofit sector from for-profit or from the corporate sector, just because I think that crisis really highlighted the desire to want to give back, to do work that had more meaning. And I think we will likely see similar happen in this situation. It certainly has come on much faster. I haven't noticed as much personally in terms of people, unfortunately, leaving their organizations. But we're also probably going to see a demand for fundraising increase, and particularly for really strong fundraisers who can point to a track record of being able to maintain and continue growth for an organization, especially as we come out of this crisis. Organizations that have maybe struggled to maintain giving to their organization for whatever reason are going to need to rebuild that revenue, and they're going to need strong development staff in order to be able to do that effectively. Some organizations may not be making direct asks right now because they might feel that it's not the appropriate time for their particular mission. But I think it goes back to the point that Lauren was making earlier. Keep in touch with your donors, steward them, even if you're not making an outright ask. Be in touch with them, let them know what's going on, and maintain those relationships so that when this does end, and it will, those relationships are still there, and hopefully the giving will come along with it.
So that's really kind of what we've seen in the past and how we think it might apply to today. But really, we also recognize that we're in somewhat unprecedented circumstances here with the slowdown of both social and economic activity, and that the environmental sector is in a different place. So we're really navigating this together. And we wanted just to share kind of some of what we're seeing and some of what seems to be working well for many organizations that are really doing a pretty good job navigating the circumstances. The first is that we're seeing organizations explore a wide variety of different ways, we'll talk about those soon, to communicate about their work, their mission, just to their community in a COVID context. But not very many are making COVID-specific solicitations. We know there can be a challenge with using urgency-based fundraising during a public health crisis like this. And, we're not the same as health and human services or arts and culture, where they're being forced to shutter their doors and seeing major dips in revenue that make super urgent near-term solicitations necessary. There are ties between environmental and conservation missions and the COVID pandemic, but they're a little bit more attenuated and they're a little bit less pressingly urgent. So, we're seeing a lot of requests for support, just, understanding that this might not be what donors are prioritizing right now. But what we do want to reinforce is that even if you're not making COVID-specific solicitations, you want to be in contact with your donors to retain them, to steward them, to keep them engaged, as Lauren mentioned earlier. But also, it's okay to keep soliciting and keep your membership drives going. We're seeing a lot of reinforcement for how much your missions matter, with even as the pandemic goes on and at times using the pandemic for cover, polluters are continuing to seek permission to pollute. The Trump administration continues to roll back conservation rules and critical environmental protections that could protect us from future pandemics as well as future environmental crises brought about by climate change. The work you're doing still matters. Your donors still know and care about your mission, and it's okay to still ask them to support you. Just don't force a tie into COVID with that solicitation, because you're not quite in the same situation as arts and culture, health, and human service organizations. That being said, right now what we're seeing with those communications, that many organizations are highlighting the ways that the pandemic is shining a light on your mission while continuing to kind of adjust how you do it and make sure that human health and safety and a sense of empathy and solidarity shines through more than ever. The way I'm seeing this most often is kind of organizations are thinking about the near-term ties, the kind of immediate ties between their mission, the work you're doing, and what we're seeing as a result of COVID, and then kind of contextualizing it more broadly in the bigger picture work you're doing and where you're trying to go. And it's okay to do that, but I would focus on those near-term ties. We're seeing a lot of really good content come out. For example, Conservation International put out some articles about what does COVID-19 have to do with nature, and then they kind of summarized 5 articles explaining those connections. They also had a really interesting Q&A with one of their top scientists, just talking about preventing pandemics such as COVID requires taking care of nature. That's kind of a really good way to keep your mission front and center, but still meet people where they are. We're seeing organizations like World Wildlife Fund and others talk about the need to shut down high-risk wildlife markets. We're seeing, NRDC talking about how we need to invest in healthier communities at this time, really start to trust experts versus rely on false evidence. Think about how we can tackle threats now so that they don't cause harm in the future. And they really kind of are talking about public health in general, and only kind of near the end beginning to bring that into the environmental connections of what the environmental situation in our cities and where we live, how that relates to people's health, as well as to the threats we see in the future. We're seeing some organizations pivot to talk about utility shutoffs and really begin advocating in a new way, join the call of others to suspend utility shutoffs, to show, that these issues are connected and their voice still matters. And we're even seeing really recently, here in Chicago, how some of the environmental factors in the background are making the pandemic worse. People who are dealing with polluted air are more likely to have respiratory infection, which is going to make a COVID infection more acute. Just recently this weekend, there was a very upsetting story in Chicago where there was a coal plant that went ahead with its demolition with city permission and blanketed a low-income, largely Mexican-American neighborhood here on the south side with dirt and particles and asbestos and lead. And so an environmental justice organization there is really raising the alarm and saying, at a time when we have an illness that's causing respiratory infection, we should not have gone forward with this demolition, and the city should have been more careful and really look at the ties between things like this and how it is going to infect people and get them sick, and what COVID does to people's health. Just one other example I wanted to share here that I thought was really creative and interesting is I saw the Sierra Club send out a mass digital solicitation asking their community to make an extra donation to on-the-ground frontline organizations helping people confronting COVID-19, whether it's food banks or health and human service organizations. And 100% of the donations went to them. And I think when you think about strategies like that, it's really an opportunity, to, first of all, make people feel proud to be associated with an organization like you that's going to be responsive and really think first and foremost about how we're all part of a community and what we can do. But it also subtly reinforces that this isn't an either or between the environment and pressing human service needs, that it needs to be a both and situation. Sierra Club subtly saying, you can give to us when we want you to, and we also think you should be giving to these other organizations because we need to address both the human needs that are facing us right now and the longer term environmental needs. Then the third part is, in addition to kind of what we're saying, we're seeing a lot of really creative engagement strategies that are finding new ways to meet people where they are, kind of very literally, when we're thinking about digital engagement, but also, metaphorically, when we think about this, where people are mentally. The organizations that seem to be doing the best right now are helping buoy spirits among their staff and keep audience engaged with really creative digital content or learning opportunities. We're seeing things like virtual tours of national parks, or even just articles that are, here are 10 great books to read about the national parks, which you can't visit, but we know you love, and let's just dig into it from the comfort of your own home. There's a lot of wonderful e-learning opportunities that many organizations are putting out, great content for those kids who are home from school, as well as wildlife webcams. I know one of our colleagues here at Campbell told me yesterday that she and her children are logging on to look at sea turtle hatchlings every single day and following along in their story. And that's a great opportunity. That kind of work really matters. But we're also seeing, new forms of engagement that we maybe haven't seen before. EDF, for example, recently sent out a mailing for ahead of Earth Day on the 22nd, and they're going to host a virtual Earth Day trivia night and just send you all the materials, the questions, the instructions that you can host pub trivia with your friends about Earth Day, right? It's that kind of thing that we're all trying to hang out with our friends on Zoom and play games and still stay engaged and have fun. It's a great way to just meet people where they are and keep them engaged with you. And likewise, we've seen others who send emails about a cuteness break to see an animal, or write an article about tips for dealing with climate and coronavirus anxiety, which includes everything from taking action online to watching a favorite show or soaking up new recipes. It's really just important to find ways that are going to keep your organization and your mission front and center, remind people of why they love it and why they're committed to you in the first place, but also meet them where they are and try and find new ways to be in touch with them. I think you can go to the next slide then, Molly, and we'll turn it over to Colleen.
Thanks, Pat. Kind of expanding or continuing on from what Pat was talking about, if you're anything like me, every company and organization that has ever gotten a hold of your email address has been in touch to share how they are responding to the COVID crisis and how it's impacting their company. Well, I think that's great. I also think it's really important, and this word keeps coming up, I think, constantly throughout our webinar today. You need to be authentic. Be clear, be concise, but be authentic and true to your organization's mission. Share what you're doing, what your response is. If there are ties and direct impacts for your organization or the mission and the work that you do, such as tying public health crises to the environment or to wildlife protection and closing illegal wildlife trade marketplaces, things like that. I think it is important to make those connections for your donors and your membership base and others who are receiving your communications. But especially, I think, for major donors, just let them know what you're doing, almost from a family type level, just to check in and say, here's what we're doing. We're all working from home. We're doing well. They want to see how you're surviving this situation, almost on a more personal level, because you've brought them that close to your organization. So just keeping that authentic and true and building those relationships despite the crisis that's going on and changing all of our daily lives. We're still seeing giving, even if there aren't outright asks being made in this situation. Donors are still giving because they feel tied to the organizations. In terms of digital engagement, we're seeing some of that evolve as well. I think in the past and even the recent past, despite how digital we all are in our lives at this point, there's still been a little bit of that sense that virtual connection is not as effective, it's not as meaningful as face-to-face or in-person meetings. But really, we have no other option at this point. So it's that or resorting to a phone call or email, which is certainly going to be less than a video call would be. So I think it's a chance to try it out and see how effective it might be, how that can be a much more meaningful way of engaging with your constituents for your organization, and testing what that might look like for engaging with your major donor base in the future, once this is over. I think it's also important to share what your needs are. If there are needs for your organization that are directly impacted by this crisis, it's okay to say so. And I think to be clear and direct about what those needs are. If you're just reaching out to keep your stakeholders informed, that's totally fine too. You don't have to make a COVID-related case if there isn't one. Don't take advantage. I think people see right through that, especially because of the onslaught of communication we're getting from every possible avenue at this point. So don't imply something that isn't there, but keep in touch because they will come back. Even if it's not now, if there's hesitation now because of the economic implications, it's still worth keeping in touch, because once some of those fears are alleviated, those donors will come back. That confidence will come back. So even if you're not making that outright ask, just the stewardship is really, really critical. I think it's also important to own that we're all figuring this out together. We don't have a crystal ball. We haven't been in this particular situation before. Even if we have been in similar situations, it hasn't quite been like this one in terms of the severity and the speed with which this has really come on. So own that we're figuring it out together. That's totally fine. And I think people appreciate the authenticity of that as well. In terms of events, I think it's kind of old news at this point that things are being canceled left and right. They're being moved to virtual formats as that's appropriate and feasible. Some things are being rescheduled into fall because that seems like a safe distance of time when we can start gathering again, hopefully. There is some concern, though, I think, from organizations that had already had events scheduled in the fall before this hit, as to what the increased competition might look like. Will there be gala fatigue come October because of everything that has been pushed to the fall that was previously going to be in March and April and May? Unfortunately, I think the reality is that that's still a question mark as to exactly what that will look like. And a lot of things around events and those gatherings are really just going to be determined by how soon all of the various stay-at-home orders can be lifted. But for those events that are scheduled in the nearer future, June, July, August, over the summer, that I think a lot of organizations are not quite sure yet if they should reschedule those or shift them. Even if you aren't making that decision at this point, it's probably important to start working on a backup plan just in case you need it. The further ahead you can get for planning for something like that is always important and always helpful. That way it's not quite as much of a mad scramble if you do need to make that decision at a later date. I also think this is a great opportunity to assess whether you need to host as many events as your organization might have. What I've heard a lot from clients over the years is that events really tend to fall in that category of, but we've always done it. We can't stop doing this. We've been doing it for so long. And the reality is this is kind of forcing the issue. So I think it can be important to take a look at, do we need to have all of these? Could we combine some of these events and gatherings that we do to maybe have them be a little bit more effective and less of a time-consuming endeavor for the staff that's responsible for putting them together and running them. It's also, as Pat talked about from a communication standpoint, this is a great time to get creative. If there's something that you've been wanting to try and can be done in this kind of virtual environment that we're all living in now, it's a great opportunity to try it. See how it goes, see what can come of it. It might be something that works out fantastically and you can run with and continue going forward. But the other side of it too is if it doesn't go as planned or as you'd hoped, nobody's going to judge right now because we're all figuring this out together. And we're all trying to adjust to this sort of new, hopefully temporary normal that we're living in. In terms of recruiting and hiring, we are really seeing this evolve as the crisis goes on. In the initial weeks, in that first week or two, when stay-at-home orders started to be put in place, we were really seeing searches, especially the more senior level searches, continue. Even talking with other firms that work in a similar space to Campbell Company, they were seeing those things continue with the modification that interviews are being done by video instead of in person. But for the most part, it was business as usual. As this has gone on, we've started to see that shift a little bit. Some searches have been put on hold if they're not for critical positions that would be a detriment to the organization to leave vacant. We're also seeing, if there were a situation of a leader planning to retire and starting a search process at this point, we're seeing some of that shift to where people have agreed to stay on to see the organization through this crisis. So organizations are kind of putting those search processes on hold at this point, waiting to see how long this will last and what better timing might come into play for the organization to replace those departing leaders. And frankly, I think it's just an abundance of caution. Again, the recession is not that far away from all of our memories. So I think there's just an abundance of caution to see exactly what the economic impact of the coronavirus crisis will be. In terms of those search processes that are moving forward, it's becoming a question of organizations figuring out, can they make a hiring decision if they have never actually met somebody in person? If it has all been virtual meetings by video call and video conference, I think that they absolutely can. It just takes a little bit more of a comfort, and maybe some additional conversations to build that level of comfort as well. But also looking beyond just that interview process and that recruitment process, what will the onboarding for a new staff member look like if it has to be done remotely and that's not something that's typical for your organization? It might take a little bit more planning, frankly, than it may have otherwise if everybody were coming into an office and you have all the resources that are typically there to draw upon and that office camaraderie. So I think those are the real questions that we're hearing around the hiring process at this point, and just in terms of how long and how extensively this will really be done virtually. I think I'll pass it back to Lauren.
Great, thank you. So next, we're just going to talk about how to navigate the current situation in terms of from a fundraising perspective. So first and foremost, it really comes down to the relationship with your stakeholders, and it's really critical to nurture those right now. Some of these next points that I'm going to speak to are really just building upon what Pat and Colleen shared with what we're hearing. So first is, if you haven't already done this, reach out to your portfolio with what we're kind of calling care calls. The key takeaway is just to keep your loyal supporters, your inner circle, your board members real close by communicating with them regularly and showing that you care. What I'm hearing right now from a lot of organizations is that people are home, they want to feel connected, and they're really appreciating the outreach. So you're not bothering them by just checking in on them with these care calls. I don't think that there needs to be necessarily a purpose in terms of like moving a relationship forward. I truly think of these in terms of wellness checks. So of course, you always want to thank them, as you always do, for being a supporter to your organization. And then just check in on them. I think so many environmental organizations especially have a wide spread of donors, both regionally, across their state, and really across the country and world. So a lot of your donors are likely living really different experiences and have different ties to this crisis in a way you may not even really be aware of. So really simple questions like, how are you? And what are you experiencing right now? How's your family? Is just going to go a long way in letting them know that you're thinking about them. And should they ask, as Colleen and Pat mentioned, definitely be prepared to inform them what's happening at your organization. How have you had to pivot, whether it's on programs, events? How did COVID-19 affect your organization? And I also say be prepared. You may have some donors that say, well, what can we do to help? And whether it's something financial in terms of giving or non-financial in terms of advocacy actions, which I know Pat's going to touch on here in a little bit, I would just be ready to let them know how they can continue to help your organization. So the next point is just leaning in on best practices around cultivation and stewardship. So beyond the care calls, I also think it's okay to engage with a purpose still. We're being granted a period of time to deepen relationships with a prospective donor or funder, to build upon conversations you've already had, and just to ensure if you have discussed any type of potential gift, that what's been discussed so far is still relevant and up to date. I know, you all know, and your donors know that your sector's work and your organization's work is not going to stop even amid a global crisis like this. So you want to show empathy and concern, obviously, for the context and what's happening, but it is okay to continue to educate your donors about what your needs are, what your programs are, and the impact that they have. And I think that across the board, again, we don't have a crystal ball. So we're all experiencing fundraising uncertainties just across the board right now. And so by continuing good cultivation, strong stewardship, it really shouldn't come as a surprise that when you do, whether it's 2, 5, 6, 12 months down the line, reach out to a donor to make a gift to a program or help fill a potential future need. If you are experiencing any gap with operating revenues, that they're going to be ready to act and support you because you've brought them along with continued cultivation and stewardship. So my third bullet point really speaks to solicitations, and it's just continuing to ask for support for the most genuine need. Again, Pat and Colleen touched upon this, but I really want to emphasize we are hearing a lot right now from organizations, especially in the environmental sector. We aren't having the same impact on our organization as health or arts and culture or human services. So can we ask? And the answer is yes. Again, I think having perspective and being appropriate with your asks and just making sure it's not just because or to risk being looked at in terms of capitalizing on a moment. But I do think that this is a really rare moment in time when people are appreciating transparency and just really candid conversations between fundraisers and their supporters. And we're telling organizations that it's okay to ask for what you need. I also think that your donors are going to understand your organization has needs that it's trying to meet. And, I remember in terms of my days of being a frontline fundraiser, you're giving people the opportunity to find joy and meaning and purpose through what can really feel like a dark and disconnected time and to connect with something they really care about and they're passionate about. So don't forget that your job as a fundraiser in terms of connecting people on that really deep, meaningful level still exists even right now. So as Colleen mentioned, people are at organizations just trying to figure out how to pivot with events. And so my thought around this is just to continue strategizing throughout 2020 for events, whether it's big events like a gala or programs or even benefit-driven opportunities, like if you have anything for a membership or a leadership circle. So we don't know what 2020 is going to bring. So just start mapping those out right now in the near and long term. I always think of events and programming. They just don't exist to exist. They're really crucial for fundraising, but also just for advancing relationships. And I think that advancing relationships piece is really no different right now. I think you can get creative. If you've been thinking about doing something outside of the box, I say go ahead and try it. I mean, no one's going to judge you right now if a program you're trying virtually doesn't quite pan out the way you hoped. But the goal is just to be able to help your donors feel and continue to feel connected and stay involved. And it even provides you with an opportunity to continue providing soft asks as part of your talking points and language to make sure people know that you're still needing their support right now. So the last bullet in this section is just about continuing the really good work so many organizations are doing to feature their content and staff. Continue to bring your content online. People are really gravitating towards virtual enjoyment and educational opportunities right now. Pat spoke to some really great ones earlier. And, I've seen, the Wilderness Society, National Parks Foundation, just to call out a couple, who've brought their favorite parks to people. And they really proactively provided these digital resources that I know a lot of people are looking to right now. And I also think that there's an opportunity to highlight different staff, whether it's on calls or programs, virtual engagements, but highlight your education team, your programming team, leadership too. The Nature Conservancy had some really great language on their website just about how they're so fortunate to have a community of passionate, dedicated people who care so much about the planet. And I think that this is a really great opportunity, whereas maybe, as a major gift officer, you would typically be the one in front of your donor. Bring in your programming person, bring in an education person, have them lead a program or an event online, and really feature them as an extension of your mission. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you have something that says make the most of extra time. And I know that it's a really weird idea to soak in and feel, since so many organizations, and especially environmental organizations, are still busy and you're still pushing your missions forward. But we're also hearing a lot about people just experiencing a gift of time. Events are being canceled or postponed. Face-to-face work for major gift officers is limited. So we've actually had a lot of organizations ask us, what can we be doing with some of our team members in extra time? And so I think that you can use this time to focus on internal infrastructure, that when you're on the other side of this crisis, it's just going to position your organization in a stronger place. So definitely think about how you can address your systems needs. This can range anywhere from database cleanup. I've heard of organizations saying now is finally the time we can work on reformatting so many of our gift reports, or, we now have an opportunity to really think through how we want to code supporters in our database. Great use of time. We've had people speak to reviewing their policies and procedures, having a couple major gift officers team up, does any policy need updating? Are they current? Do you need to add anything in? Now's a good time to review those, which we tend to kind of keep at the bottom of our to-do list when we're so busy meeting with donors and putting on events. And then next is just make sure you have some ways of working in documentation, like an operations manual for your team. On what I would say is maybe a more somber but just realistic note, it's really important to cross-train right now in the immediate near term, and documentation is a critical part of that. You want to have a simple staffing plan, because you don't know if some members of your team or perhaps their family members may become sick and need care over the coming months. And so making sure that someone can step in for a gift processor, or someone knows whose portfolio needs what, is going to be really important, just to making sure your organization continues to move forward during this time. I also think that you can be developing more in-depth strategies for your major gift prospects. Take the long view and really think through a strategic approach. Now is a really good time for planning, reviewing and refreshing your portfolios, and just thinking through as a team how you can focus on donor relationships. We also encourage you just to leverage volunteers who right now are home, and some are really willing to volunteer and help you. So think about if you can have calls with close supporters to do some peer screening, or perhaps map relationships. Now is a good time that perhaps when your supporters are a little busy or it's hard, you can really have those one-on-one calls to say, I'd love to run through a list of folks. I'm wondering if you know who these people are and how we can advance strategy for them. And then last but not least is I just put a general other ideas. But I've been guiding a lot of organizations around, if you have that long list of prospect research right now, dig into those, do a handful a day if you have that extra hour of time. Or if you know that you have grants coming up in the fall, get a legwork and maybe start on some of the writing now, so that when everything does feel like it's ramping up again and events are on and so forth, you know that you got some of that grant writing down in advance for 2020. And then lastly is just qualification. If you wanted to be putting a system in place or a process or a script, now's a really good time to develop that. And I just want to point out that we've heard from many organizations who are using this time as part of those care calls to actually get to know people who are perhaps in their universe but not yet in portfolios, and get to know them better. Just why do they support the organization? What programs do you care about? Just a couple of light qualification questions can really give you a better sense and put you in a better position to move forward with meaningful and active relationship management, because you've already had that natural, meaningful touch point. So just something to think about too with qualification work. So now I'm going to hand it off to Pat, who's going to talk all things messaging and communications.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. And I'll be relatively brief here, because I know that we've kind of been touching on these throughout all the various creative engagement and communication strategies we've seen. But I think there are a number of commonalities that we just wanted to pull out from some of the most effective communications we've seen. So the first is, we really do want to recommend that wherever possible, you try and keep your messaging brief, clear, and calm. People are being communicated with in many different ways by many different people. They want to just really kind of get to the heart of the matter. They want to be reminded that you're a steady hand on the tip, and also be reminded that in the midst of these extraordinary times, the work of conservation goes on, and you're continuing to be vigilant and push it forward. We do think that there are many opportunities to highlight the connection between COVID-19 and your work. It's a zoonotic disease, I believe I got the term right, that, is very related to everything from global wildlife markets to deforestation. We know that with climate change, the new migration patterns that will come about with that, there will be many more pandemics. They might spread more quickly in the future. And we also know that environmental justice is at the center of this because it affects things like people's respiratory health, which are very much affecting how the COVID-19 disease impacts them. So definitely don't shy away from highlighting those, but also don't force it. Every communication doesn't have to put the most urgent COVID-19 storyline front and center and try and tie your work to it. It's okay to talk about other things and to talk about other work you're doing that matters. So on that note, we do want to say, keep your mission on people's minds, right? That's a great form of stewardship, kind of just as you go about stewarding and staying in contact with your donors. Your mission matters. It matters to them. And we want to make sure they're not forgetting about it. And try and find ways to just meet people where they are in very authentic ways. Right now, many of us are indoors more than ever, and it really does bring about an appreciation of public space, of green space, of nature. Feel free to write about that, write what it means to you, write what you're missing, write what you're thinking about or how you're connecting with it. There's a great op-ed, for example, from the Trust for Public Land about how the pandemic brings about a new appreciation for public spaces. Likewise, as people suffer a great deal of anxiety, think about how nature can be part of the healing process, how nature really can calm us. Think about what it means to hear birds chirping when you throw your window open. I know the Audubon Society sent out a survey to everyone, just what do birds mean to you? On a personal level, I actually bought a birding book from my local bookstore just because I love hearing the birds and I want to learn about it. But, as you do this, just don't play the hierarchy of needs game. Just consider where you fit in, what your mission means in this context. And keep in mind that people and nature thrive together. Even as we see some storylines, for example, about global emissions declining, that's not something to celebrate. And we don't want to undermine the connection between people and nature that many environmental organizations have been messaging about in the years leading up to this crisis, and that is going to be even more important going forward. Just a couple more quick tips. One is don't be afraid to give people an escape. Like I was saying, that's one of those things nature can offer. I think of the video of the penguin at Shed Aquarium that went viral. People just love those little moments of happiness, of joy that nature and animals can bring us, and go ahead and give them that. The Wilderness Society, to use another example, posted a series of nature meditations online, this really calm music with footage that they spliced together of various public lands. It's really wonderful and is reminding people why they care. We want you to continue to emphasize advocacy, equity, and environmental justice. Again, with equity and environmental justice, we're drawing those links between people's needs, people suffering, and the environment around them. But also with advocacy, it's the kind of thing that is ongoing and that you can do virtually or from a distance. So it's a great way to give people an opportunity to take action, to stay engaged, and to feel a sense of efficacy. And then finally, just as you continue to develop new crisis-specific messaging, just make sure that you're remembering to stay in touch internally, to train your staff and volunteers so that those messages can get out there, and you can continue to build awareness and buy-in for your organization, both now and going forward.
Thanks, Pat. To address some of the strategies from more of an executive search standpoint in terms of recruiting staff, retaining staff, continuing to engage with your team as well. Really, video is the answer to almost every question at this point, whether it's related to recruiting or so many other things. I've really found, especially in the last month or so, as we've all been working virtually, using video calls and video conferencing is really as useful for interviewing as it can be for, staff and client meetings as well. Just helps to feel a little bit more engaged than you might if you're just connecting by phone or email. I think it's important to keep that connection up with your colleagues, especially, as well as others that are outside of your organization. And try to allow some time to just connect on a personal level. Don't make it all business the way you may have done a couple of months ago, even. Take that time to talk on a human-to-human level and recreate some of that water cooler atmosphere as much as possible when you have that chance. I also think it's really important to point out that it is possible to do an entire recruiting process by video or virtually. Our executive search team at Campbell Company has actually done this a number of times. And while it's previously been driven by concerns about travel expenses or just to kind of keep things moving in a little bit quicker timeline, it's actually proving to serve us really well that we have that experience engaging at that level and being able to navigate some of the inevitable challenges that come up with this format, because we have done it in the past under less mandatory circumstances, frankly. But it is possible. You just kind of have to work a little bit harder, I think, to build that comfort level. Excuse me. The other thing, a little bit of my soapbox personally in the last couple of years, and Lauren touched on this as well, succession planning, I think, is super important right now. If your organization does not already have at least emergency succession planning in place, this is a great time to really start working on that. I think this crisis has highlighted the need to be prepared just in case you do lose a staff member, if somebody gets sick or a loved one gets sick and they need to be out to care for them. It's important to know who can cover those critical tasks while they're gone. So cross-training is really important. Make sure that job descriptions are up to date. Identify who on staff can step in to cover certain responsibilities if somebody is suddenly, unexpectedly unable to work or to perform those responsibilities. And I think even if people have left the organization and those positions are being left open for now out of an abundance of caution or, any number of other reasons, that's probably not going to be the case forever. This crisis will end. It's important to keep our eyes on that bit of information as well. So being prepared for what skill sets, what qualifications, what criteria people will need to bring to serve in that role in a permanent capacity once your organization is ready to go through that hiring process for anything that might be open right now. Really focus on the future. I think really the lesson we've learned from every single crisis that's true in every single crisis is that at some point it does end. You want to get through today and the next few weeks in the best way possible, keeping up with the constant evolution of this crisis that seems to be changing day by day. But it really is important to focus on the fact that we will not be in this situation forever. Keep that future in mind when making big decisions, whether it's big decisions about if you need to possibly eliminate some positions, cut some positions back, or hiring, whether you move forward with that at this point or if you do hold off. Keep that future in mind, the future in mind as you're making some of those big decisions. Don't make them based just on the information at hand today. And remember that recruiting can take a few months. You may not be ready to bring somebody on board right now. You may not necessarily feel that you're well prepared to make those critical hiring decisions this week or next week. But by the time you get to that part of the search process, you might be ready. We might all be back in the office by then. So keep that in mind and what that timing might look like and what that process might look like to bring somebody on board as well. The beginning stages really can be done virtually, really effectively, really successfully. So it might not be a bad time to get started on some of those things if you do know that there is a critical position you're going to need to fill in late summer or fall. So just keep some of that timing in mind as well. And just thought I would address a question that's come up in another of the webinars that Campbell Company has hosted recently. In terms of accepting a job, or offering a job in this environment, I think it's fine to do that. I also think it's fine to say if you have other questions that you want to ask or feel the need to ask a lot of questions. It's totally fair, I think, to ask how an organization has weathered other crises in the past, especially the Great Recession, what that looked like for them. Did they shrink as an organization? Did giving change? And how are they responding to this one? And what are they doing to ensure the sustainability and effectiveness and growth of the organization through this period of time? And in terms of onboarding, I think it's just a matter of finding ways to do what you would normally do, but virtually. And I think it can also help to assign or create sort of a buddy system, frankly, for new staff coming on board. Whether that's in the office, I think it could be really effective in that space as well. But even virtually, just to have people to check in with and answer questions that aren't necessarily a direct manager for a new staff member, to create sort of that camaraderie that you might get in more normal circumstances as well. Thank you. I'm tossing it back to Emily to wrap us up.
Thanks, Colleen. So we will now be taking audience questions, so please send them through the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel. We also invite you to share your experiences and how your organization has been responding to COVID-19, so we hope you send those through as well. So our first question is, could you please offer suggestions on the best ways to maintain close communication with major donors in addition to a phone call or email?
Sure. Well, I'm happy to take this one. And I think just building off of what Colleen said, video is just really serving a strong purpose right now. So obviously hard mail is just sort of out for the time being, as we're not in offices. And people are kind of, I think, feeling a little weird maybe about mailing some things, but definitely utilize video. I also think that beyond a care call, you're saying maintain close communication. And so beyond a care call, and if you aren't ready, perhaps to ask for your donor for support, it's not the right time, whatever the case may be, I think giving your supporters a purpose can just be a really nice touch point if you do have folks you're working with in your portfolio. So if you've been brainstorming some ideas and you want to, bounce off ideas off of them, bring them on, make them feel like a partner with you, and just build that partnership so that you have it for the future. And really just asking for their thoughts, again, leveraging volunteers, whether it's asking them to do care calls for you or seeing if they can review lists. I think there's a lot of ways you can maintain close communication that isn't just a redundant care call week after week. So think through what those strategies are and how it can definitely play for the long term in terms of bringing this person in closer to your organization and just strengthening their connection.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, in terms of communications, what would qualify as tone deaf? I'm trying to be authentic and empathetic, but also want to make sure the needs of my organization are shared.
Yeah, I can at least start answering that. Then Lauren and Colleen, feel free to jump in. It's more of an art than a science. There's not like a precise answer here. I would say just try not to go too far either way. There's a version of tone deaf that's leaning into COVID too hard, and everyone's saying at this time it shows how our mission is more important than ever, right? And the truth is, it's not making every single thing feel more important and urgent than ever. And you don't want to just try and shoehorn what you're saying into whatever the story of the day is about COVID. Try and really, like we've been saying, make those connections feel authentic. At the same time, I think the other form of tone deaf is to basically ignore the context, to, just kind of communicate with people with the kind of messages you always have without at least acknowledging that our world is changing, that they might be in a different circumstance today. Really make sure you're starting with some acknowledgement of what you're seeing around you, what they might be feeling, or kind of how your organization might be reacting or dealing with the crisis we're facing before pivoting to, again, a really genuine, authentic solicitation around the needs that you still may have and the urgency that your mission still may carry even in this context. So not too don't force it to be COVID specific, but also don't ignore the context that's on everyone's mind.
Great, thank you. We have time for one last audience question, which is, we are embarking on a campaign and are wondering if it's appropriate to move forward with funders during this time. How should we be working on our messaging and planning while still being sensitive to the current environment?
Pat, do you have anything? I know you mentioned campaigns earlier. Do you have anything you want to speak to this and I can follow up?
Yeah, I think, it's in general, like I think Lauren had shared at the very beginning, what we've seen in the past is a lot of campaign timelines be extended. And I think it's okay to kind of extend out your solicitation plans, for example, if you're major donors, depending on where you are in the campaign. But it's still important just to be in touch with them and to remind them of how your campaign, why you're still looking long term, how you've been planning for something that's not going to matter only right now, but for 6 months, for 5 years, for 10 years in the future. And I think that there's a real opportunity to continue to drive some of that internal work if you're earlier in a campaign, especially around things like your case and communications. The important thing there, your donors will appreciate, I think, that you have a strategy that's not just, kind of blowing in the wind, even though you want to make sure you're responsive. I would just think about kind of creating a set of messages and a set of kind of more flexible materials for the time being. You might not want to print your brochure in case the narrative is going to be adjusted slightly in a different context, even if your focal points and what you're working towards is the same.
And just to add to that, in terms of approaching funders, it's definitely appropriate, I think, to say wherever you are in a campaign, we were thinking about talking with you about a potential gift of support. Is now a good time? How are you feeling? Would you prefer us hold off this conversation? Again, I think it's about bringing people along, checking in on them, and taking the cues about how they want to advance. So it's okay to approach and let them tell you how to proceed, because some donors will still want to give, or at least move forward with conversations around giving.
Great, thank you. We did receive one last question, so I'm going to try and squeeze it in. Do you have any thoughts on how to get funders to lean into their giving and mission? I know many are concerned about the stock market and their assets and pulling back as a result. I think this is not the time, and they shouldn't be saving for a bigger emergency.
It's a good question.
It is. So I'll just, I'm happy to kick this off. And Pat, if you have anything to follow up with, I'm not sure in terms of funders, if you mean individual or corporate or foundations. What I would say here is just, I think of fundraising as a, individual case by case basis. So knowing your relationship, the knowledge you have about them, and hopefully the fact that you're communicating and you know where they are, try to map out some sort of plan for them. If you have funders that are concerned about the stock market and going to hold on their assets, you're not going to likely change their mind. That's a decision that they made. But you can always be providing some thoughtful updates about your near-term programs, things that need to be funded near term, if you're experiencing any operations gaps. And that way you're giving them an avenue that should they want to support you, they're able to walk through that door and help you in terms of funding some sort of need or initiative. Team, anything else to add around that?
No, I think you answered that really well, Lauren. I think it is, meeting them where they are is the only thing you can do. I think in terms of engaging them, especially I would assume that if it's a foundation or if it's this might be a major donor, I would just reinforce to them their leadership role in your organization and in the community, and ask them that at this time of urgent need where many are pulling back, that if they would be willing to step forward instead and help lead the way and set an example for others, just remind them of the importance that their giving plays in really demonstrating how you want people to react, even as others may be pulling back.
Great, thanks so much. And with that, we'd like to thank you all for joining us today. We also encourage you to visit our COVID-19 resource page where you can read our advice, review resources, and schedule a free consultation with us. Within 24 hours, you will be receiving a follow-up email from GoToWebinar with a link to the recording and resource page. In the meantime, please don't hesitate to email our presenters with any questions you have. Thank you and take care.